In this case, the subpoenas were not a last resort, which is typically what they're supposed to do when there is an alleged leak hunt. They are, this time it came within 48 hours of the first story being published and less than that of the one about his plane not being fully equipped the way the current Air Force, real Air Force ones are, the ones that were commissioned by the military. You are correct. This was something that was quite known in Washington. It was not a surprise. And the reason that the reporters were looking at the fact that he was flying a different plane was because he posted a Truth Social comment about it, about how he was taking the old one for old time's sake, which was a little hard to believe. This is not just issuing subpoenas. It's sending federal agents to people's homes, as you said. The goal is very clearly intimidation. It will now almost certainly be something that comes up in Jay Clayton's hearing and Todd Blanche's hearings this week. The problem that senators have, Joe, to your question about Jay Clayton, is they have to decide whether they want Jay Clayton to be confirmed to take over, or do they want to keep Bill Pulte in place, who they are more concerned about, as best as I can tell. But this obviously complicates things this week.
Yeah, Jonathan, one of the most remarkable of so many remarkable scenes in your book is when we go inside the Situation Room. With your reporting, we find out that Todd Blanche is in effect trying to figure out how to cover up the Epstein files. Now, you tell me, how do 51 Republicans get to voting for a guy that was at the center of the Epstein file cover-up?
Well, it actually, that those scenes just demonstrate that the wall that existed between the White House and the Justice Department that was erected after Watergate, in terms of not having White House direction of Justice Department actions that veered into politics or into investigations of individuals. One thing we've done a lot of reporting of, which we document in the book, is Trump has completely torn down that wall. He gives directions publicly and privately to the Justice Department. No one is in any confusion about who he wants prosecuted, who he wants investigated. And the clock is ticking. I mean, we have reporting one of the key reason that he became dissatisfied with Pam Bondi, who he's trying to replace with Todd Blanche, is because he was dissatisfied with the speed of prosecutions of his enemies. That was the number one thing. It was not Epstein. It was not all the other things people speculated. It was simply that Trump wanted results, meaning people behind bars, people like James Comey, Letitia James, all sorts of other people that he has on the enemies list.
So, Maggie, I want to get your thoughts about President Trump's relationship with Senator Lindsey Graham, passed away suddenly over the weekend. You know, they obviously had their ups and downs from the 2016 campaign, but Graham had, and then we saw another break after January 6th, but Graham had become a reliable ally and advisor. And, as much as he's a shapeshifter in his political life, Graham was consistent. He was trying to push Trump on Ukraine. And also, that's where he was hours before he died, but also talk to us about the role he played in advocating taking the fight to Iran.
So it's really remarkable, actually, watching the White House's reaction to Lindsey Graham's passing. It was utter shock, John. And as you say, yes, he was a political shapeshifter. He ran against Trump quite famously. One of the most memorable moments in 2015 was then candidate Donald Trump reading Lindsey Graham's cell phone number out loud at a rally when they were fighting. But Graham did become one of Trump's biggest Senate allies. He was sort of I think I heard you say earlier that he could make adjustments of Trump's behavior on the margins. That was of great value to the White House, not just to the president. And so when it came to Iran, Lindsey Graham was one of the people who very forcefully advocated, as you said, for aggression against Iran. And he was consistent about that. And he was consistent about that in the lead up to the beginning of the war on February 28th earlier this year. He was one of several hawkish voices who were in the president's ear. There were a number of people who were close to Benjamin Netanyahu, who had good relationships with him. Lindsey Graham was one of them who Trump was listening to. I don't want to overstate it in the course of the lead up to the war. We make quite plain in our reporting in the book, and we've talked about this before, that it's more complicated than just that Trump was being puppeteered. He also was much more hawkish on Iran than his own advisors wanted to see, or than a lot of his supporters wanted to see. And so it wasn't that much of a closed door for Graham with Trump in the lead up to this aggression. However, absent Graham, I do think it is going to become a little more complicated for Trump in terms of liaising to the Senate and certainly to Netanyahu.
Maggie, you have been covering Donald Trump literally for decades. And as a younger man, he was always interested in pursuing fame and wealth. The reporting in your book that you and Jonathan have put together is both astonishing and frightening, especially given what's happened to the federal government during the Trump tenure. In your estimation, what are the biggest differences between the Donald Trump of 10, 15 years ago and the Donald Trump of today?
It's a good question. One of the reasons that we set out to write this book, the way that it came out, this particular book, we had been talking about writing one as the last act of Trump for several years, and we had a contract starting in 2023 to write the book, but we ultimately focused it on this particular period because we wanted people to understand how radically different this term is from term one. That's not to say that Trump is a different person. He is not. But he is a version of what Steve Bannon describes in the book as pure Trump. And so I was listening when you were talking about how he was always about fame and about wealth and amassing both. He's still about both of those things, but he is also about power. And he has always been about power. And his ability to harness it now is pretty astonishing. And one of the things that we are trying to make clear in this book is how his advisors, a very small group of them, spent 4 years preparing for this term, for how they could grab every lever of power, how they could essentially cow other people, other lawmakers within their own party. With they're open about it, they use the term iron fist, and they have. The Senate is not a body that had really bowed to Donald Trump the same way. In fact, Trump hates the Senate, and he's quite clear about that all the time. But House Republicans are acting as an extension of the executive branch. And so Trump is essentially unchecked for the last 15 months. And one of the things that was remarkable when we went in to go see Trump in March of this year is he was quite open about that. And the way in which he was open about it was presenting us with this incredible document listing, what he described as the top 10 of history's, conquerors and monsters, Hitler, Mao, Stalin. I mean, I can go on and on here. You get the point. He was not looking at it from a moral dimension. He was looking at it from the dimension of, and this was somebody else's comparison to him, but he was enjoying it. I don't know that he is going to have that same unchecked power for the next several months. Clearly, his ability to bend around to his will is not working. If they lose the House, I think things could look somewhat different, but I don't think it is going to look like 2019. So is he different? No, he is just more of himself and more of the version that is solely focused on power and crushing enemies.
Jonathan, let's talk a bit more about that unchecked power and something that you mentioned earlier, which is the breaking down of the firewall between the DOJ and the White House, which I still think is one of the most consequential things that has come out of the last year and a half. And yet the president hasn't come into office and managed to get those people he wanted the DOJ to take retribution against, people like Letitia James and James Comey. They're not behind bars.
Right.
So how does he feel about that? How does he feel about his co-opting of the DOJ and yet somehow being thwarted by the legal system at the same time?
Well, we still have courts in this country. We still have juries. We still have a system. And it's of great frustration to him that some of these cases have been falling over. We write in the book, senior people in his Justice Department, including Todd Blanche, did not think that they had a strong case against Letitia James, for example. Trump wanted it to be known to the senior people at the DOJ, and we have this in the book. He said Todd needs to understand that Trump doesn't really care if there's a conviction. The process is the point. He wants to make her life miserable. And so even when, yes, of course he wants Letitia James behind bars, of course he wants all of these people behind bars, but the fact that they're having to spend money to go through the very painful process of investigation, prosecution, the stress on the family, that is also sustenance for him and revenge for him.
And that's the kind of old Roy Cohn playbook for him. Maggie, talk about the other side of that, which is the power that he's taking on with the pardon process. And how does he see that working for him? Because in a sense, yes, he has the legal right to do what he's doing, but it is the breaking down of that firewall still between an independent rule of law that America is known for and the political process in the White House.
One of the things we describe in the book is how he and people close to him say that he just experienced the pardon process as or his power as a revelation, essentially. It was quick, it was unilateral, and it was what he wanted all of government to be. And that is what he is trying to do now across all fronts. It obviously isn't, as Jonathan just said. He does have the power to do pardons. When you raise this issue, when one raises this issue with people in his government, they will say, publicly and privately, this is the thing that the Constitution allows him to do. That's true. But usually it has been some kind of a process. And there have been erosions in that prior to this term, but this is not going through some extensive DOJ process. This is people who, in some cases, pay millions of dollars to find people who can get in the president's ear directly. The White House has tried putting in place a process that often breaks down because there is this side route, which the president clearly prefers. One of the remarkable things in terms of the accountability piece, and we write about this too, is when I was saying it's not going to be like 2019 if the House flips, the president has openly said that he is going to pardon to people in his circle. He'll pardon anybody who's come within, sometimes it's 250, 225, the pardon zone around the Oval Office. And we've spoken to people who are counting on those pardons. So I don't know what it looks like in 2019 in terms of House subpoenas, because the only option that House members have is to refer a contempt of Congress charge to the Trump DOJ, which something tells us is probably not going to jump on them quickly. So he's legally entitled to do this, but it has broken it down dramatically.